Projects either live or die in the edit. It's the moment that's going to make or break your story. You can have the most beautiful images and the most powerful narrative, but if you bungle the edit, that's just going to be a mess of images. Today we're going to dig into the steps that I walk through in my edits, so you can take notes and hopefully take your stories over the finish line. September is for Storytelling wraps up this week, which means that this is the last week to enter to win the Filmmaking Kit. That's the kit that includes the Rode Wireless ME, Aputure Amaran 60XS and the softbox, a Alonzi phone grip, and an 80-inch tripod. To enter, make sure you watch the whole video and you're going to see exactly what you need to do. Just a reminder, it's not too late to go back to the other videos from the month and enter. Every one of the September is for Storytelling videos gives you the opportunity to enter and increases your chances to win. So what's coming up after this month? Well, there's a ton of new gear and applications that have come out this month that I'm planning to cover. We've got the iPhone 15 Pro, which I did a preview of already, but now I've got it in hand, and I want to talk through how it works in the real world. Then we've got the Blackmagic camera application, which is a huge advancement for smartphone filmmaking. Finally, I've also gotten my hands on the Alonzi U-Mic, which has potential to be a great budget system. I haven't taken it out of the plastic yet, so I have no idea how good it actually is. We're going to find out. Enough about the future though. You're here to learn about editing. Before we jump in, let's watch a video I shot earlier this summer and use it as a base for the conversation. Earlier this summer, I've talked about this a lot, I partnered with an organization called World Renewal to do some trainings as well as capture some stories of what was happening in Brazil. We captured a few brief pieces to share with their supporters so they could see some of the work that their funds are supporting. One note on this video. I broke one of my own rules and I really shouldn't have. It's something I even taught you guys not to do. I filmed from a darker location into a brighter spot, which meant the lighting wasn't as good as it could have been. Earlier in the week, I filmed one of my YouTube videos in the same spot and I had a false sense of confidence, but that YouTube video was filmed on a day where it wasn't as bright and it worked a little bit better. The shot with her is a little more contrasty than I wanted, and I had to do a lot of work in post to make it look better. Additionally, the mic died on me, which isn't the first time, it's been happening recently. So what you're hearing is actually the on-camera microphone. I ran it through some post software to clean it up, but it still wasn't up to my standards. Did it negate the usefulness of the video? Of course not. They were still able to use it and it worked well and it shared the stories with their supporters. But it's always good to still look objectively at projects you do to see where things can be improved. Without further ado.
So 30 years ago, there was a group of 5 or 6 people that came from the United States. They had gotten to know Telly. He had an internship in the United States with Word of Life, came to Brazil and just felt the call to plant churches. And so actually on that trip, they made some calls home and raised the funds to buy that original plot of land where they built the first church, Community Church of Carpina, 30 years ago. And it's just been a roller coaster ride since then of how God has expanded and grown the ministry. Last year, Telly and I got together and we were like, let's have a really, really amazing 30-year anniversary. So let's invite as many people who were there 30 years ago, starting this whole vision, the first group of Americans that came to come together, as well as inviting all of the churches. Over 35 churches have been planted in 30 years. We have 20 missionary families that are now part of the team here in Brazil, inviting everybody to come together and have an event. It was actually at a local gymnasium at a local college here. And we filled it up. We filled up all of the seats. We filled up the sidelines, and just to be able to look out over the crowd and see how the faithfulness of Telly and Heather and so many that they trained up over the years has affected so many communities, so many families, and will continue for the next 20, 30, 40 years. So how incredible to be able to celebrate 30 years, but something that was repeated over and over was that we could not do this without you. Without the support, the faithful support of people like you who give, who have given, who have invested, whether you've been able to see it in person or not, to believe in the vision that they have here for church planting and investing in these communities. We are so grateful and thankful. Thank you for your continued support with us for the next 30 years.
Before you edit a single clip, it's important to make sure you organize your project. I have never been the most neat and tidy person around. In fact, if you were looking at my studio right now, you'd see that. But even I can acknowledge the importance of a clean project. You need to know where all the pieces are for the story that you're telling. Often when you're working on your edit, you're going to run into creative roadblocks. More often than not, I find myself throwing different shots at the timeline to figure out what's going to work and help the story progress. It can be incredibly frustrating at times, but it's made even more frustrating if I'm having to search for the pieces that I want to test out. So it's important to keep things organized. There are two areas where you're going to organize your project: in your file system and in your editor. Both are pretty similar in practice. In your file system, you want to have folders to keep all the individual pieces of your project organized. This way, if you need to import a new element or share something with another editor, it's easier to quickly find those pieces. Additionally, when you're finally done with your project and all said and done, this allows you to easily archive it away without needing to track down files all over. I hate it when I go to archive a project only to discover that I've left a file on the desktop or in my downloads folder or some other random place, as well as in the project folder. It makes things stressful. Here's how I typically organize my projects when I do it right. I usually have a main root folder for the project, starting that folder name with the date in year, month, day format. Then I'm going to make sure to describe whoever the client is or whatever story I'm telling, something that's going to help me later figure out what that project was. Inside that root folder, I'm then going to have different kinds of folders for all the different types of elements. This can be as simple or as complicated as the project calls for it. I usually at least have these root folders: footage, audio, graphics, and exports. If things are a little more complicated, I'm going to make subfolders in each of those. For instance, if I've got multiple cameras for a project, I'm going to make a folder for each camera in the footage folder, or maybe for every shoot day. Or if I have sound effects, music, and some dialogue, then I'm going to make folders for each of those in the audio folders. Then in exports, I almost always have a single subfolder: rough cuts. This is where I put all of my edits until I finalize the project. Once I've finalized everything, I then export that directly into the exports folder. This way, when I return to the project in 6 months, I'm not having to remember if it was version 4 or version 5 that I settled on. I just know that whatever's in the exports folder was the final. I do a similar system within my editing platform. Most editors allow you to have bins or folders within the project, so I'll typically duplicate my folder setup in the program. Footage with subfolders for cameras, audio with folders for music, sound effects, and so on. The only one that doesn't really end up in the project that's in my file system is exports, because you don't usually re-import your export once you're done. Otherwise, you're just creating an eternal loop. After the project's organized, I now make my footage more accessible with what's called a selects timeline. The selects timeline is a way of weeding out all the mediocre and downright bad shots in your edit. We've all got them. You know, the shots where you accidentally left it rolling as you walked around, or the times when the shot just didn't turn out like you wanted it to. I'm not going to go too deep into this because I did an entire video on the topic, but it's important that you take the time to go through your clips to identify the best ones. Simply put, the selects timeline is you going through the footage and finding the good and best shots, and then trimming out all the parts that didn't really make the cut. This helps you because when you go to drop your B-roll into your edit, you've got a timeline that you can pull from where you know that every shot in there is at least good. Also, if you ever need to pull from the footage again in the future, you can export that selects timeline and have it as a reference point so you don't have to do all the work of sorting all of the footage all over again. If you want a deeper dive into how I make my selects timeline, check out the video in the description. The ARoll is the meat of your story. This is what drives your narrative forward. ARoll is something like an interview or a person talking on camera. This is ARoll. Specifically, you're using the audio and some video of the shot to tell the story. It might be an interview with a person who's been impacted by your organization, or maybe it's the director of the organization sharing the story. It doesn't really matter who it is, it's just that this person is who's driving your story forward. When I approach the edit, I like to first go through and cut out all the dead space, the space between questions of an interview, the portions I'm definitely not going to use. Sometimes it's as easy as just grabbing the in and out points on a script that was delivered, but sometimes it's editing out all of the portions where the lines were flubbed or the interviewer asked questions. From there, I go to construct my story. On easier edits, where it's a script that was delivered, I just clean up any small flubs in the delivery and place everything where I want it. If it's an interview though, I try to think through how I want the story to flow. Not every interview ends in a sequential order. Sometimes I'm going to come back to a topic later in the interview if I think of a new question or something kind of guides me back there that might relate to the beginning of the story. For the world renewal pieces, I ask questions specific to each video and each topic that we wanted to hit on, and then I let my friend Rachel share where things were at. She was great on camera, and I found that I didn't need to ask a ton of follow-up questions. Most of the things that I asked for after the main questions were just to get like a conclusion statement or to get a call to action to make the ending a little bit stronger. More often than not, I found that I just needed to trim down her responses to fit the time limit that we were aiming for. It was all great content, but sometimes you need to cut out extra portions so the viewer can focus on your main story. It can be hard to choose which portions to cut out, but make sure you're asking them if each piece is really important to keep in. If you end up having too much extra in the script, then people are going to lose focus on whatever the main story you're telling is. Music can completely change the tone of your video. It can create a sense of fear and dread. It can make everything playful and happy, or it can make someone feel sadness. There was a popular trend a few years ago where people would re-edit a movie trailer to a completely different genre. Home Alone as a horror film, The Shining as a romantic comedy, and Stephen King's It as a family film. One of the tricks that these trailers used was changing the music out to something fitting of the new genre. When picking your music, look for something that fits the feel that you want for your video. If my video has any spoken word in it, I try to stay away from music with lyrics. More likely than not, you're going to need to do some retiming of the song to fit the content for your video. The best way I've found to do this is to find points where the beat hits, and then find a similar spot earlier or later in the song with a similar beat hit. Then cut on both of those beats and pull the portions that you need to extend or shorten the song. This can also allow you to pull moments from a song earlier or later to fit the tone of the portion of the video. So like if there's a happy moment earlier in the video, but you want that happy moment later, you can move it by doing this trick. I find it most helpful if I'm editing someone's personal story, where they're talking about a point of redemption in their life. You might want something more somber earlier in the video that turns to something cheerier later on. This trick allows you to move those moments around as you see fit. The other thing to watch out for is to make sure your music isn't distracting. If it's too loud or if it has certain instrument hits, it might end up being distracting to the viewer. Take it from me. The music in some of my earlier YouTube videos was too loud. It wasn't blaring, but it was just slightly too loud and it was in competition with my voice. It distracted people. You want the music to fall into the background, almost being so subtle the viewer doesn't really realize that they're hearing it. If they're focusing more on the music than the content, then it's too distracting and you're missing the point. The world renewal pieces held a pretty consistent tone throughout the videos, so I found that I really just needed to edit the music for length. I went for something upbeat and cheery, but subtle enough that it would just fall behind the main audio. I also ended up starting with the music a little bit louder, but dropped it down right before she started speaking, and then I brought it back up at the end of the video. You only want to do this if the music's going to be playing without speaking for long enough to make it really worthwhile. So you can do this in breaks in between when you have a breath in your ARoll, but you just want to make sure it's for long enough, otherwise you're just going to keep going up and down. Once I've got my ARoll all set with my music underneath, I go to drop in my BRoll. The music and the ARoll help to give the piece structure, while the BRoll gives extra information to tell the story. Since we've already made a select timeline, it makes my life significantly easier. I'm able to just jump in and grab the specific types of shots that I need for each section, and I know that I'm pulling from clips that are already good. I pick my BRoll based on what makes most sense for the story. I try to drop in clips specific to whatever my ARoll is talking about. If they're talking about the craft that kids did, I'll show that on screen. If I'm talking about happy kids having fun, I show that. Whatever the content is, I find something that matches it. That being said, sometimes you're not going to have a clip that perfectly illustrates whatever's being said. In those instances, I find footage that fits the mood and the content as well as I can. The key is to drop in B-roll that illustrates the story without being distracting. Similar to what I talked about last week, it can be helpful to show mini stories. Cut together wide, medium, and tight shots to show what's going on at the events. There's a few tricks that I try to do when I'm editing together the B-roll. If the music has a strong beat, I try to make my cuts match the beat. Now this doesn't mean that I cut on every single beat hit, but I try to use those hits as motivation for a shot change. This helps to tie the energy of the visuals to the sound of the music, and it makes everything a little more cohesive. Similarly, I try to utilize something called a J or an L cut. Essentially, these cuts help to hide cuts in the ARoll. Basically, all they do is they offset the cuts in the B-roll with the cuts that are in your ARoll. If you line the two up, then it's going to be more obvious to the viewer that you spliced the ARoll in your story. If you offset it though, it's not as obvious, and the viewer might not notice that you spliced two sound bites together. This is a great time to mention that I did do an entire video giving 10 tips for a better edit. Check that out to hear a few of the tips that I've talked about in this video, as well as a couple things that I didn't hit on. The link's in the description. The world renewal piece was mostly what I would call a montage edit, so I just found clips that illustrated whatever is being talked about in the script. I didn't edit together a ton of mini stories for this one, instead opting to show the variety of what was going on throughout the video. I honestly wish I had intentionally filmed a couple more of those mini stories though, as I think it would have set me up to focus on some of the details that I missed. For the majority of stories, the only graphics I add are text. I might add titles at the start of the video, a lower third to identify my speaker, or I might add in a little bit of text to bridge the gap in an interview. Additionally, if it makes sense stylistically, I might add in text to illustrate a statistic that I want to draw the viewer's attention to. The key is to make your graphics clean and make it feel like they fit into the overall look of your video. I'm not really a graphic artist, so I'm not gonna lie, this is one area I sometimes struggle with. I can make something look decent, but a true graphic artist can really integrate the text into your shots. When I'm adding in text, I try to look at the frame to figure out what the best place to put it without being obnoxious. Sometimes that's finding a blank space in the corner of a frame to drop someone's name, or dropping it in the center and anchoring it to the top or the bottom. If the text is the primary focus of the shot, I might place it in the center of the screen and adjust the opacity of the shot behind it. Other times, I'll add a very, and I mean very, blurred out drop shadow just to give a little bit of darkness behind the words. Make sure whatever colors you're using jumps out from the frame while still being legible. You don't want to use a font or a color that just gets lost in your image, so you might need to play around with it a little bit to see what's really going to work. I didn't use a ton of text in the world renewal pieces, instead focusing on dropping the URL in for the organization during call to actions. I wanted to focus on the visuals of the story, so these stayed pretty simple. I could have added her name or the title at the front, but I opted not to for the sake of simplicity. Now, a video that's edited but not delivered isn't going to do much for inspiring others. The delivery is going to look different for every organization and every video, but the key is that you want to be delivering your story to wherever your audience is at. If you've got a pretty good email list, maybe you want to deliver your video over email. The best way to do that is to upload your final edit to YouTube or to Vimeo or some other hosting site, and then embed a clickable image and a link in your email that drives people to watch the story. If your audience is primarily on Instagram, then you want to upload your story as a reel. Anytime it's possible, you don't want to link the audience away from the platform where you're already engaging them. This isn't always the case, but if your audience is primarily on Facebook, then maybe you just want to embed the video there instead of uploading it to YouTube and then sharing a link. Most of the platforms favor media that's been uploaded directly to the platform as opposed to external links. Plus, it gives the ability for most videos to play automatically without the viewer needing to engage it by clicking play or something else. This means you're going to get more eyes on your video, which hopefully means a larger response. Additionally, you're going to want to make sure you archive your project. For me, this typically means that I'm going to upload a final edit to Dropbox so that it's archived in the cloud, and then I'm going to take that project folder where I've nicely organized everything, and I'm going to transfer that from my edit drive to my archive drive. It's basically just a slower drive, but it's easier to store on it. This way I can pull the project down if I ever need to reference it again, but the final edits are all backed up and easily shareable if I need to give the file to anyone. And with that, September is for Storytelling comes to a close. It's been fun, guys. Make sure you like this video, you subscribe, and comment the answer to this week's question. If you do all that, then you're entered to win the Filmmaking Kit. This week's question's a two-parter. Where are you creating stories for, and what camera are you currently using, or smartphone? If you haven't already, check out the other videos in the series and enter on those videos as well before it's too late. Remember though, we've talked about a lot, but it's not about the gear. It's all about the story.